Welcome back to another episode of No Free Lunch, Economics for a Fallen World. I'm Dr. Jeff Guernsey, and I'm joined, as always, by Dr. Jeff Heyman. So, Dr. Heyman, we've talked about demand before and downwardly sloping demand curves and all that, but now you want to change that a little bit, derived demand. So let's tee up this question. Why are teachers paid differently than professional athletes?
It's clear. It's a travesty of justice that an economics professor is not paid as much as a professional baseball player. Of course that should be reversed, we would think. That's a great question. Thanks for asking. I mean, that's a lot of our concerns are really, what's fair? Why do we value this athlete so much higher than a nurse or a teacher in kindergarten, which is so socially valued? And the answer really comes back to this question of derived demand. When you think about the demand for baseball players or anything else which determines their value, it's derived from the underlying value that consumers place on the output product. And for some strange reason, we as a society might value home runs much more than we value an economics lesson. There's another facet to this as well. And technology weighs into this a little bit today as well, as we start to see some singers and writers, for instance, making billions of dollars, like J.K. Rowling, for instance, is the span of the ability to support. And that the derived demand might be, hey, each one of those 50,000 people at the stadium only valued a little bit, maybe just as much as much less than, say, the parent of a kindergarten student. But there's 50,000 every night going to these baseball games, whereas there's only 30 kids in this. So that efficiency plays in as well. The reality is it's how much we value the output product will determine the value of the inputs to that product. In this particular case, these things like sports, we really value collectively at social level, all the people, and many times, as you know, there are millions of people watching it on television. Each one of those has value. That gets added to it, and so that tends to drive up the value.
So you said value, we'll come back to that in just a moment, but is there any, how would you approach someone who says, well, a professional athlete gets paid more because there's a skill level that not all of us have. So maybe there's a lesser supply, if you will.
The supply and demand, thanks for clarifying. I should have said that because supply and demand always are indicative of that. But supply and demand are going to drive every value that we have. But clearly, the demand function is what I was trying to emphasize in that aspect. The demand function is going to be different because of the ability for us to add in the demand of a much larger market that would be added into that. In that particular case, the thousands upon thousands of people that go to a baseball game and the talent level that's there. They're going to want the highest level of expertise. One of the things I think you're really getting to, it's the ability nowadays with technology for one individual almost, or very few individuals, to capture the whole value. So one of our favorite economists, Russ Roberts, likes to talk about this. 500 years ago, if you were a pretty good singer, you could make a living down at the local bar or something singing, for the cafe. Whereas now, with the kind of technology we have, one single opera singer might capture the whole opera market because everybody will buy the CD or the streaming service and so forth. So again, the multitude of adding up the vast majority of customers that can come in with technology fits in that part of it as well. But the point that I was trying to drive here is that the value we place on those inputs are based on the value of the output. And it's the collective value to all the people that benefit to that output.
Okay, so let's come back to value for a moment. You make a distinction and help us out here. Intrinsic value versus instrumental value.
Yeah, because that's where we really wrestle with this. I mean, because of course, intrinsically, an economics professor ought to be paid more than a baseball player, or for some strange reason. But no, we know that there's no such thing as intrinsic value, per se. The only intrinsic value we have is that value that God ascribes to us because we are created in His image. And so there's that objective intrinsic value we have as creatures made in God's image. But in terms of the market, that that is all going to be assessed subjectively by the products that we produce, in my case, economics lessons, and that will be subjectively assessed by the many people in the market that might buy my economics lessons or any other product you might buy. And so we tend to value these inputs, again, this is related now, instrumentally towards what the output would be. So if people really value economics lessons, then I'm going to have a higher wage. If they don't like economics, then I'm going to have a lower wage. And that's what we mean by this. There's nothing inherent in my inherent dignity, which I have as a creature made in the image of God, that mandates that somebody else is going to want to buy my products and services. It's if they like the output, then my wage rate will be determined because of that. And so there's a reason why, as I say in the textbook, as much as you love your beloved pet, we are going to pay a lot less to veterinarians than we are brain surgeons, because of the value of the output, i.e. the saving of life of a human versus the saving of life of a dear pet. Now, not that we don't want them to live, but the reality when your dog gets very, very old and there's many thousands of dollars bill to give them maybe a day or two life, you're going to make a different calculus than if it's grandma. That's just the reality.
Yeah, good point. All right, so let's dig deeper. Last topic here, concept that economists would love to talk about. Marginal revenue product, you have that in the book, and then connect that with derived demand.
Yeah, so part of this is really, it goes back, there's a fallacy of thinking that people are paid according to what maybe the employer might, in their mercy, decide to give and so forth. The reality is the competitive market process assures that workers will be paid according to what they can bring to the table. Again, that their value is derived from the value of the output, which means they have to produce some output. And that the marginal revenue product would be, it's a way of describing the value of the output that they would bring to the table. The marginal worker, that last worker, if you're making a decision in your little fast food shop to hire another worker, how much more sales can you get because of that worker? If that worker can provide $10 of profit per hour in additional sales, net of all other costs, then you're going to pay that worker $10. And let's say that you try to be cheap and you only want to pay them $6 because you're greedy. Well, the problem is, even though you might be greedy, Jeff, I'm greedy too, and I'm down the street, and I know my production process would be, it'd be worth $9 if I could hire that worker. I'm going to bid that worker away for you. You're only paying $6. Well, it's worth $9 to me. The competition tends to get us, doesn't get us exactly. You don't get always these things to work out exactly, but the process tends to this result, and that's why we see a lot of movement in between jobs. People won't drop usually for a nickel, but there's some occupations, people, you go have a nickel an hour difference in wage rate, they're moving down the street. It does happen. There are other factors in our compensation that weigh in. But again, circling back to what you said, the output and the pay that we are willing to give someone is directly related to their output, and it's the value of the output that they bring. And competition tends to lead to that being equal to them getting their output, value of their output. We call that the worker. We would say, as the Bible says, the work is worth his or her wage. And that wage is going to be dependent on how much they bring to the table themselves in terms of productivity.
And in a free market, that worker should be paid what they produce.
They will. That would
be
the competitive
marginal product.
The competitive process will have a tendency to take their wage rate to be equal to what we call the marginal revenue product, the value of the output they produce.
Yeah, very good. Okay. Well, thanks. Thanks for joining us for this conversation about derived demand and a few other topics.